Hello and welcome to today's seminar together with NORSAR. Today we're going to talk about extracting the truths about the war in Ukraine with new monitoring technologies. And first we're going to have a presentation from Ben Dando. He is head of department test ban treaty verification at NORSAR. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you. Yes, so if I go to my first slide and I will give you a brief introduction about what we're doing. Actually, if I go back here. So I'm going to talk to you today a little about how we have been using seismic data to monitor what's going on in Ukraine and how this potentially can be used to improve general conflict monitoring. So, as was said, I'm from NORSAR, and NORSAR's main role is to act as the Norwegian National Data Centre for the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organisation. And so this means it's our responsibility and our role to monitor for nuclear tests or nuclear explosions around the world. And we do this using our expertise in seismic and infrasound monitoring. So if I start here with looking at where do we get our information from for news reporting for wars? Well, we have the traditional media, we have the television, we have radio, we have newspapers, and then we have the social media aspects, so Facebook and YouTube, for example. And these information between these different sources is overlapping, and there is exchange of information between the two. But despite having all these amazing and huge amounts of information available to us, it's still challenging to be able to work out what's actually true, what is actually going on within a conflict zone. And you can see here, for example, there's some videos that were posted on TikTok at the start of the invasion, and this was spread throughout social media, and it became quite quickly clear that these were fake videos, and it's being able to discern that truth that's particularly important. So the question then is how can technology help us do this? Well, the big question is we want to find out is where, when, and what's happened within a conflict. And data is ideally objective. It does not have the subjective bias that you perhaps get from personal or anecdotal accounts. So this is a nice way to verify what has actually happened. There's potential use here in being able to improve disaster management as well, for example. If we know exactly when something happened and where, we can send the necessary response as needed. Here I'm showing a satellite image, so this is some existing technology that already exists, and this provides incredibly good detail spatially what happened. We can provide images of where an attack has happened and see what sort of devastation has taken place. But from my perspective, as a seismologist, what about seismic and infrasound monitoring? Can we use this technology as well? So, a nice cartoon showing what happens in an explosion. What happens to the energy? We have energy that propagates through the air as subaudible sound waves, and this can be picked up by infrasound sensors. But we also have energy that goes into the ground as seismic waves, similar to an earthquake, and this can be detected using seismometers. So we're using the same technology to monitor explosions as we do for earthquakes, for example. So it's worth pointing out that there is an international network of both seismic, infrasound sensors that is designed for monitoring nuclear explosions throughout the world. So this is part of the CTBTO, and you can see how this works in practice, so that when there's an explosion in North Korea, for example, then the signal will travel through the Earth, and we can pick it up in Norway, for example, within 11 minutes. And the signal has traveled all through to the other side of the world within 20 minutes. But how do we go from monitoring nuclear explosions to monitoring the sort of activities that we see in an active conflict zone? It's incredibly important to note here we're looking at completely different scales of explosions. So I have a table here showing kind of the typical size of certain explosions. And you can see that for military size explosions, we are looking on the scale of kilograms of TNT, whereas for nuclear explosions, we're looking at the scale of kilotons. So if we want to be able to pick up this sort of activity using the same technology that we use for monitoring nuclear explosions, we have to have a lot more sensors potentially and a lot closer to where the explosions are taking place. So if we zoom in around Ukraine and look at what stations are available from this international network, we can see that we do have some infrastructure there. But again, is this good enough to pick up the sort of explosions that we want to pick up? Well, we can calculate what sort of detection level we can get using these sensors. And actually, as a seismologist, we talk about seismic magnitudes, which you often hear about, and we can pick up between 2.8 to 3.0 magnitude. And there are some ways of converting this to an explosive yield. And in this case, that corresponds to being able to reliably detect explosions of at least 60 tons. So again, these are big explosions and not the sort of everyday explosions that you would see in a normal conflict. So if there was a nuclear bomb, for example, that went off in Ukraine, we would detect it using this system. So back to our problem of being able to detect exactly what is happening, where and when within Ukraine. Well, if we zoom in to this single station around Kiev that happens to be in this international network, then we can actually see it's not one station, but it's 25 different sensors. And this configuration has been designed in such a way that we can detect small nuclear explosions thousands of kilometers away. But if we think about the data that is collected at this station in a different way, and we design an algorithm specifically for monitoring this region using these sensors, then actually we can change the focus and we can detect small explosions close by to those sensors. So that's exactly what we've done. We've implemented a new algorithm just for this region using these sensors, and we can see what we get. So this is a bit technical, but I think it's quite fun because it shows how the actual algorithm works. So essentially, for every single point in time, we scan through space and we search for where the energy that we record is coming from. So we essentially back project the energy to every single point in space, and we search for explosions. So you can see we're scanning through now, and we have low probabilities of an event. And then we hit a point, this yellow point, and this is where an explosion has taken place. So all the energy is back projecting at a particular time and at a particular location. So here's an example of this algorithm working in practice. So on the 20th of May, there was a Russian attack on Malin train station very early in the morning. We were getting data coming through to Norway continuously, processing it, and within 15 minutes of that attack occurring, we had processed it, an alert had been sent out, and we had detected 3 explosions within 25 seconds of each other, with a magnitude of 0.8, which corresponds to about 300 kilograms of TNT, and this is a typical size for a missile strike. And then, notably, 4 hours later, this attack was then provided to social media by the mayor of Malin that this had actually happened. So we were able to quickly and accurately determine where an attack had taken place before it became public knowledge. And this is just now a photo showing the aftermath of this attack. So there's a large crater by the train station, and some reports from the media that this has been investigated as a possible war crime. The Russians had claimed that there was a convoy of weapons within a train at the station that had been attacked. And the Ukrainians had claimed that that was not the case. So these are the sorts of conflicting reports that actually we need to be able to get the truth from. And using this sort of analysis, we can at least come some way to be able to work out what's happened. So that was a single example of one attack. But we can go back and see from the start of the year, before the invasion of the war, what do we detect right up to the start of November. So I'm going to show a timeline now of all the events that we're detecting. So this is in the start of January, and we're detecting explosions. These are from mines and from quarries that exist in the region. So we're even detecting these sorts of explosions. And as we get to the 24th of February, we're going to see a step change in the amount of explosions that we detect. So we're coming up now, and we start to see all the activity that we detect. And I'm sure from consuming the news, you do not see this level of detail of the sort of military attacks that are going on or have been going on in the Kiev region in Ukraine. So we went from about 2 explosions a day from mines and quarries up to about 28 explosions a day up till the 31st of March. And then the Russian withdrawal from the region on the 2nd of April, and it stops again. And we start seeing much slower rates of attacks. We still see some explosions where there are airstrikes and particular missile strikes, but it's not at the same level that we were getting throughout March. So you can see occasionally we still get these steps in the amount of explosions that we detect, and this is from these targeted strikes at particular times and locations. So this is showing the same graph now with some key features highlighted. So you can see the start of the invasion towards the end of February. 7th of March, we detected the most amount of explosions, so 64 explosions in a single day. We saw the last heavy bombardment on the 31st of March, and then what was reported as the Russian withdrawal a few days later. But there was a time period where pretty much all explosions had stopped before the withdrawal. And then we see these targeted attacks on certain towns and provinces, so on Zhytomyr, on the town of Marlin, and on Korostan, and we see that going forward. So, as we are so keen on getting meaningful interpretation from these explosions, we want to be able to detect or use our detections and compare them to what is being reported. So thankfully there are resources such as the Live Universal Awareness Map, which essentially goes through the web and gathers information using artificial intelligence. This information is collected together about activity that's happened in Ukraine. It's then fact-checked by analysts and is published online. And we can compare these reports to our detections. So this is exactly what we've done for this particular region. And you can see our detections are the blue lines and the reports are the orange lines. I think this is perhaps the easiest graph to look at. And you can see, to begin with, there are more reports than what we detect. But in the end, we end up seeing a lot more detections than is actually reported. But the overall trend is that we are matching what is being reported. So this is a nice verification of what is being reported using seismic data, which is objective. So, this leaves us with both some challenges and opportunities. I have not talked about this region in the southeast of Ukraine. This is the region where most of the military activity is going on. And the reason is because we don't have the infrastructure there. The Marlin array that we have been using for detecting events and explosions around the Kiev region is unique within Ukraine. So that's both problematic in that we can't detect at the same level of detail in this region, but it's also an opportunity because it means that actually, if we take what we have learned from the Marlin array and we are able to deploy such sensors, perhaps temporary sensors, and supplement it with, say, infrasound sensors, then actually we can achieve the same sort of level of detail in what we can monitor. So I think there's a great opportunity in what can be done there. So yeah, there are various factors that can cause challenges. So the events might be too far away, they might be too small, and sometimes we have multiple explosions occurring simultaneously, and this is particularly difficult to be able to detect automatically. So if we actually dig into our data, we can see there are times when perhaps we've only picked up one explosion when there has been a series of explosions. But we can still at least go in and see that and quality control our data to verify certain events. So, to summarize, there is more information than ever for conflict zones and for war zones. But being able to work out exactly what has happened is still a challenge. And this is why we need forms of objective data to be able to back up what has happened. And technology can help us get there. So having this sort of network of seismic sensors in an active conflict zone is unprecedented as far as I'm aware. And we can use this as a learning and an opportunity to be able to really get to the objective truth and use this to deploy in future conflicts as well. So I'd just like to finish as well by saying a lot of this work is thanks to both the staff at the Ukrainian National Data Center who operate this sensor, who have been very kind to allow us to work on this data and to publish on it. And this is also a group contribution by people at NORSAR. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
We have a panel here to take the discussion a bit further on how the development of your tool can be used by other sectors. So please, Sebastian Schutte from PRIO and Rolf Skatteboe from Kongsberg Satellite Services, and Philip Ulvin from NRK. Please join me. My name is Andrea Ronstrand. I'm the news editor of Forsvarets Forum. Sebastian, when we spoke on the phone, you said to me that the first casualty of war is truth. Would you say that this is as relevant today as it was when it was said during the First World War?
I think very much so, yes. And that's because underlying fundamentals, political fundamentals haven't really changed. When two countries go to war, both sides want to present themselves in a favorable light. The other side is the aggressor. They abide by the rules of war. The other side attacks civilians. And this is something you've seen throughout history and throughout the 20th century and even today in Ukraine, of course. So historically, this has meant that reliable information about the wars that have happened have only been collected by academics. So you cannot go to the UN today and ask for a list of all the wars that have happened. Such a list does not exist. Because if such a list existed, then the countries of the world would start arguing about reparations, about violations of international law. So the first of those lists was really compiled almost 100 years ago, and we're still at it. We're still collecting data. but in our ability to do so, we are limited to currently historical accounts, news sources, investigative journalism. And I think Ben has shown us a possible glimpse of a future where this information can be amended with remote sensing technologies.
So you work on peace research, and Philippe, you work on monitoring the daily news events for NRK as a foreign reporter. You both kind of daily have to separate truth from lies, I guess. Could you say something about the challenges and the obstacles in finding the truth in a war or in a conflict?
So, maybe is this on? Yeah. As you said, the major challenge is the fact that we rely on the parties in the conflict for a lot of the information, for access to areas. And so usually the first report we will get of an event is always from some kind of authority, or very often the case. And so immediately when we get such a report, we have to start the work of verification. If the story we see the information as credible. And this goes through a lot of tools, and hopefully one day NORSAR's work will be available to us also. But it goes through very simple things such as checking if there are videos, images of an attack or of a reported war crime, if there is some kind of documentation, and then there has been, since the war on Ukraine, developed a lot of competency on how this verification work is done. So there is a project conjointly with a lot of Norwegian media, which is called Faktisk Verifiserbar, which gives us the opportunity to develop, to send journalists there to learn and then to come back. And also to send on a need basis images or videos for verification. It also goes through verification of satellite data, or for example tracking services such for airplane crashes, or for navigation data for ships and so on. So this is a very intense work where we have to balance the also the need for information, the time, which can be challenging. Often we will publish a first report with a lot of kind of forbehold, as you say in Norwegian. I don't know. Where we take reservations on what we can ascertain for as truth. And what we only have as reports, and so yeah, it's been interesting to see how this has evolved only in the time that I've been in the NRK, since May, and yeah, it's a work in progress, and we hope to.
That balance that you have to meet between getting out information as quickly as possible versus to make sure that it's verifiable is incredibly interesting, and striking the balance there, I'm sure, is tricky. How often do you see events having or reports having to be pulled back as false? Is that common, or are you confident in what goes out at the moment?
So usually we will never. I mean, that's really the worst case scenario, if we have to pull back a story and say that we've been wrong about something. Most of the time, we will have taken enough precautions about how we word ourselves, how we present the information, so that it will still stand the test of time. But as we can take a very recent example, the explosion in Poland. I was not at work at that time, but I know that once those reports came in, there was a much larger need to get the news about the explosion itself out, and then all the kind of circumstantial or essential but additional information we could not ascertain at the time. So obviously that report initially was full of kind of nuance or precautions.
Schutte, how do you work with this? Do you use some of the same methods as reporters do, or do you have other ways to find and verify information?
So there's an academic research community that works on different aspects of conflict research, and very rarely would any individual researcher who's interested in a particular question or a particular conflict go out and collect their own data, because the effort is just too great. The quality assurance requirements are just too big. So we have a number of data sets that are being updated and released, and specialized research group, Uppsala in Sweden, PRIO has been doing this work. They collect this data. And we take it as an industry standard, knowing that it is flawed in certain ways. But the data is flawed in ways that can be taken into account. So for example, it is very, very difficult to establish a total number of people killed or wounded in a war. That is about the hardest information to really ascertain. And then the easiest information is that the war has taken place. So there are these different layers of timing, of which actors were involved, which political actors, which casualties, under which circumstances, and we know the uncertainties associated with that, and we try to convey them and keep them in mind and convey them to the readers of our articles.
Mm. And I understand you cooperate on a project in establishing that something has happened, where you can measure the movement in the ground, and then is your role then to find out what has happened?
Yeah, so there's a big international push. Just the other day, 80 countries, including Norway, have signed an agreement on doing a better job protecting civilians in urban areas from explosive munitions. So you cannot really realistically ban the use of explosive munitions. All heavy weapon systems rely on explosive munitions, but you can say not against hospitals, not against schools, not in urban areas. And this has been just a political wish for a very long time, but now we're seeing 80 governments committing to this and trying to emulate the success story of nuclear test ban treaties, the success story of banning landmines with sort of regulation on explosive munitions. And they don't know how, but NORSAR does. And so we're trying to work together with NORSAR, communicating the needs from the political science side of things and the policy side of things in terms of what coverage do you need, what density of sensor network do you need, what are the system requirements, how can we use simulated data, conflict event data that we have that come from military sources that have been either leaked or declassified to understand what level of detail we would need. And then NORSAR, of course, is on the research frontier of making this a technological reality, and hopefully we can join forces and see a future version of such a system, a sensor network system, actually be deployed.
So we have another competence here in our panel. Rolf, you work with surveilling from space. So we have one that works underground and then one that works from space. Could you kind of say something about how your technologies helps painting a picture of what's happening on ground?
Yeah, I'd like to do that. And thank you, Ben, for an interesting discussion. You put a new perspective on what's actually happening on the ground. Being a satellite guy, I represent the objective eye in space. But that has some limitations because traditionally you need a satellite, and you need a satellite over the right area at the right time, and you need, preferably for some satellites, nice weather. But combining the suite of satellites that's flying these days with, for example, a radar satellite or an optical satellite, or even a satellite that measures emissions, you can get a pretty objective picture from space. But there's a trade there between resolution and timeliness and spatial resolution. So if you want to look into something that has a super detailed area, like the train station, for example, you need to know where to look. So you have to have a combination of something on the ground that can actually tell the satellite where to look, or else you will just drone in data. And the challenge now in Ukraine is to pinpoint the actual information, the information that's of critical interest to the parties. There are basically every satellite in the world is looking at Ukraine these days. And as a side comment, the MaxStar pictures that are shown everywhere, they are downloaded through Norwegian ground stations. But that's sort of something that's not very, very important, because it's all about getting the data down fast so it gets back into the analysts' lab and find out how they can look at the changes from one point in time to another. So being objective is a good measure, but it has some challenges in the beginning.
I haven't prepared you for this, but I had an interesting conversation before Ben's presentation, and I was asked to bring up the nuclear power plants in Ukraine that has a lot of the reporting has been of what's happening there. Maybe, Philippe, could you say something about the difficulties in reporting around these areas? And then maybe, Ben, you could say something about how your technologies can be used to verify information from these areas.
So with mostly we've been following Zaporizhzhia and Chernobyl at some points, but mostly Zaporizhzhia. And this power plant, obviously, it's really on the front lines. So the Russian and Ukrainian authorities keep contesting what's happening there. And there have been numerous messages about missile strikes or attacks in the vicinity of the compound. And actually, in this work, we've been using a lot of satellite data. It's actually possible to see to a large extent which compounds, which part of the compounds are attacked, or where there is military equipment stationed. The Ukrainians were at one point, without us being able to verify it, saying that the Russians had stationed troops and a large amount of military equipment there. And then at some point we looked at satellite imagery that showed rows of armored vehicles and stationed right next to reactor compounds. So obviously using the compound as a shield. So yeah, this is an example of where we have kind of been able to verify reports, but there's a lot that we don't know. For example, the working conditions of the crew there. We have been having to rely on reports from either the authorities or the IAEA when they have been able to go there. So it's challenging to see exactly what's going on, but we've been, with the help of technology and some independent assessments, to do some good reporting on this.
Yeah, I should add some context actually to why some of this work was started. And the reason that we started to look at Ukraine was not specifically because we wanted to track the progress of the war in such detail, but that we wanted to know if a nuclear power plant was struck, because that has huge international consequences. So if we could at least monitor the power plants, then we would come some way to be able to provide that information. So I think there's 4 main nuclear plants in Ukraine, plus a research reactor. So we were very much focused on those regions to begin with, and it just so happened that we started observing all the other activity when we were monitoring those power plants. In the case of Zaporizhzhia, this again is in the southeast of the country. So this is in a difficult zone based on the infrastructure that we have. So we are well placed for monitoring Chernobyl. We're reasonably well placed to monitor the power plants in the west of the country. But Zaporizhzhia and South Ukraine are still shadow zones. Having said that, yesterday morning we detected the strikes that went on overnight. We could see an explosion, at least within the vicinity of the region. But the work, for example, that we are looking into with PRIO, with infrasound sensors, where we measure the subaudible sound waves through the air, if you are placing those sensors around Zaporizhzhia, for example, not only can we work out to a better level of detail where the explosions are coming from, you can potentially find out where the rockets are being fired from. So you can hear the place where the missiles are being fired from and where they're landing as well. So again, we're not there for Zaporizhzhia, but the technology does exist. It just means putting out the necessary infrastructure to do so.
Yes, as I see it in this unfortunate situation, there is a lot to be learned. One is obviously to monitor what's happening and to be able to verify what's the truth or not, and that can be done in different ways. But it's also, as you're alluding to now, to develop mechanisms and systems that can prevent something in the future. And I think the latter one is an important task right now. How to combine different types of sensors. You have your ultrasound, you have your infrasound, you have what you do on the ground. Then from the satellite side, there are more and more satellites coming up. As a side comment, it's launched about 7,000 satellites since dawn of time in 1957, and it's scheduled to be launched 10,000 more satellites till 2029. Basically, an explosion in number of satellites, and that gives you much better spatial and timely resolution in areas where you need the information. But it also means that you could get different sensors. It struck me when you talked about what you saw at the imagery. Now you have satellites that can do RF emissions. You can basically find a vehicle. You have satellites that can do carbon emission. You can basically find where things are happening, and you can do other sensors. And you get, if you have enough resources available in the sky, you can very easily verify what's on the ground. But we do need the ground to find out to find out where to start looking.
Yeah, there's so much complementary data available, and it is about bringing it together into a coherent narrative, and then using that in reporting or using that in terms of the geopolitical consequences. But it's just getting the individual aspects together and interpreting them in a sensible way.
Yes, and I think the end goal wouldn't have to be like a perfect crystal ball that can see every last explosion. But things that are super important and within technological reach are, for instance, intentional attacks on civilians. So prior to the war in Ukraine, even the Russians have used these so-called double tap strikes in Syria, where they bomb a residential building, the building collapses, first responders arrive on the scene to help the buried civilians, and then the site is struck again to kill the first responders. And I mean, that is morally absolutely deplorable and a clear violation of every international law related to the conduct of war. And right now we can't catch them, because if it's only the site of the destruction, there will be competing narratives. Well, it was just return fire. Well, it was a single strike. And then it is down to very brave investigative journalists to go there, to conduct a whole bunch of interviews, and maybe walk away with with evidence that a double tap strike has occurred. But if we automate this process and words gets out that these monitoring capabilities exist, maybe even in combination with a UN mission that has a strong mandate to go after violators of human rights, then we might see change without being able to monitor every last explosion. We just add capability to the international community and peacekeeping efforts.
And that's actually a very good point as I see it. We do some maritime situational awareness as well, meaning we're looking for ships, and it can be used for oil spill detection. And the mere fact that everyone knows now that you can find a ship and you can see if it pollutes prevents pollution.
Exactly.
It's super easy. So that's the way to go as I see it. And again, if you can do it in a timely manner, you mentioned the minutes you had before you saw the results, and you have to deliver the results. For that on the ship arena, without diverting the discussion into maritime domains, we have about 10 minutes the timelines for detecting a ship and notifying European safety Maritime Safety Agency of an activity in European waters. So if it's less than 10 minutes, you're good. If you're more, then it's bad. So obviously that combination has a good impact.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And there's of course parallels with the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. So the monitoring system that's in place there has shown that people cannot test nuclear explosions without people knowing about it. There are obviously some states that want people to know about it, and that will continue. But for the most part, for most countries, they realize there is no hiding in terms of testing of nuclear weapons.
You, in your presentation, you gave an example where you had registered explosions, and then a couple of hours later, the local mayor came out giving information about the incident. Is your registry secret in any way, or do you kind of publish right away? Are there any kind of, do you have to be careful to publish too early because maybe someone can just say, oh, that was not us?
Well, at the moment, the information is not being publicly shared. So we are sitting on this information, but that it's not secret. We are happy to share that information. So if there are people who would make use of it, we would share it. But there is not, first of all, the knowledge that we have it. So once that information is out there, we are happy to say, look, we can help with deciphering what's going on.
But would you do that kind of minute by minute, or would you kind of verify a
There
little bit first?
There would need to be some verification, some quality control to make sure that what we are seeing is not, for example, an explosion from a quarry.
Yeah.
We need to say, yes, this is a military attack.
Would you like to comment on that, or?
I'm just wondering how you technically make the difference between what is a military attack and what is not.
Yeah, and part of that is where is the explosion? So is there a mine and quarry where we detect an explosion? Well, if there is, then it's most likely related to that. But we can also see the size of the event. Quarries have particular size explosives. Military attacks have perhaps slightly different. And something that is still an active research area is a detailed analysis of the signal to be able to both distinguish between quarry and mine blasts versus military explosions. And there is also the potential there to be able to differentiate between different types of munitions. But this, again, is a research area. This is not something that's that's active at the moment, but it's something that at least has been shown can be done.
We're touching upon something important there, and it's the availability of information and whether it's verifiable or not. So I think as information providers in the broader sense, as you might be in this area and we are with information, our task is to provide to present information. I mean, we shouldn't, well, at least we shouldn't go into and do detailed analysis or interpretations, because that will always be biased. But the fact that the information is available and it's known that the procedure of getting it is reliable and verifiable, then somebody will be able to use it in a more elevated level for analysis. So, for example, again, back to Ukraine, on the first part of the war, there was a lot of satellite imagery just being published, and that was a clear decision made to just show, hey, we can see you, we can know what's happening there. But nobody really did do any interpretation of the column of vehicles, for example, going into Kyiv, because everyone could see it. So it's the balance of having in your case, I would guess, having a production line, quote unquote, that produces a map, and that is what you have, and that's what you present, and then somebody else can look at it.
And it's worth noting as well that actually these sorts of data can still be misused. They can be misinterpreted. You can claim an explosion is from one side versus another and still not know the truth. We just know that there was an explosion. So there's still a gap to be filled here of being able to verify exactly what happened. But it's at least coming some way to that point.
And some of these technologies, the example again being the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, are also best, put in the hands of agencies like the UN, because there is also a military proliferation risk. So one example could be Hamas for a while has used a lot of these like homemade rockets and shot them into Israel, and of course they don't have satellite-based battle damage assessment, or they don't have like super advanced targeting systems. So we don't necessarily want to teach them how to use infrasound to this effect. So we have to be careful and responsible with the sort of technological capabilities that we're building. But by building the technological capabilities, I think it is safe to say that we're working broadly in the morally right direction right now, and we will keep governance and proliferation risk in mind every step of the way.
We have 3 minutes left, so I thought maybe a final question could be, could this be used broader than it's done today? My impression is that the Ukraine war is the first time that the public has seen those type of satellite images, and you're developing new methods of registering explosions. Is this only used in Ukraine, or is there kind of a broader potential?
We hope so.
Yes, I see it. It's a very good example on combining sources. I mean, we're more and more so into this information pool. This information is everywhere, and by combining information, creating systems that can be used has a broad application. In a lot of regions, as I see it.
I think that this technology, obviously satellite imagery, has been used in reporting and in research for quite some time already, but the difference now with Ukraine is the amount of tools that we're using and the types of tools that we're using. It's exploded. It's to an extent we've never seen, and it's no longer just the kind of specialists in the newsroom who are toying with these tools, but it's really for everyone who is working with breaking news or foreign affairs, and this competency, I think, we will carry with us in the world of journalism. And hopefully one day, I was just working with my colleague Halvard Sandberg, who is much better than me at using these tools. He was looking at, for example, satellite imagery showing disturbances in the ionosphere, which enabled him to show that there was a possible path of a cruise missile. And so once you have that, and you have NORSAR's tools showing where a detonation could have taken place, then you're almost tracking missiles from launch to explosion. So I think that in 5 years, our war reporting will be, or the information that we will have will be something else.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.